Way back at their WWDC developer conference in 2021, Apple gave us HomeKey, which means you can unlock your front door with a quick tap of your iPhone or Apple Watch. But at first, HomeKey was really confined to the very high-end part of the smart lock market. Many early models cost more than $300. And while prices have come down, in part thanks to locks like the U100 from Aqara, it's still pretty expensive. And just like Aqara has done for years with their sensors, they now have a less expensive alternative called the U50, which takes advantage of their Zigbee protocol and their hubs. It also drops the fingerprint sensor you have on the U100 and supports Matter compatibility with an Aqara hub. And most importantly, it works with Apple HomeKey. But as I'll get into in a minute, this lock is an incredible deal for some people, but not as much for others. I'm Eric Welander. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, we talk all about Apple and smart home tech. So if you're into those things, consider subscribing for free. And thanks to Aqara for sending me this U50 lock ahead of the launch with no strings attached. This video is not sponsored. Now in the box, you get the usual pieces for installing a lock like this on a North American door. Nothing there is really all that unusual, so I'm not going to go into tons of detail about the installation here in this video. And you also get, of course, 2 hardware physical keys for the lock, and there's a keyhole hidden behind a sliding metal door on the front of the lock, so you can unlock it without any smarts. And you can also take this center part of the lock to get re-keyed if you want it to match your existing keys. Now, one other thing to keep in mind before you start the installation process is that your existing deadbolt shouldn't have a lot of resistance as you lock or unlock your door. If it does, you're going to need to adjust some things about your door and your door frame before you start installing it. Now, once I had the hardware installed on my door, which was a very straightforward process, one of the things I noticed right off the bat is that with the darker color, it's harder to tell from a distance if it's locked from the inside, especially at night or when there isn't as much light around the lock. Hopefully this is a little bit better with maybe a brushed nickel or silver finish that Aqara will probably ship just like they have on the U100. Now, of course, once the lock is on your door, you need to add it to your smart home. And to do this, there's a HomeKit code on the inside part of the lock underneath this outer cover. And you can go straight to the Home app, scan the code, and walk through the steps to add the lock to a particular room in your home. My advice, if you have a smart doorbell, is to also add this lock to the same room as that. That way, when you're going to look at your smart doorbell footage in Apple Home, you can quickly access nearby accessories in that room, which includes the lock for that door. And then you'll also be taken through the HomeKey setup process. Now, this also gets me to my first problem with this lock that will mean it's not optimal for some customers. So when you go to set up the PIN codes, which people can punch into the front of the lock to get into your home, you have to have a minimum of 6 digits. My Slagen Code Plus works with 4-digit passcodes, and I know that 6 digits is more secure, but plenty of people I know outside of my home live in a 4-digit passcode world, and they would prefer to keep it that way, especially for their front door. A lot of people have a particular code that many people around them know and also correlates with maybe other PIN codes that they need to access other parts of the home. And so having to go from a 4-digit code for all of those to something that's 6 digits for this can be confusing and just more overhead. But I don't really think Aqara had a lot of options here, so I'm not really going to blame them for this requirement. Now, once you have your code set up, to enter them on the large touchpad is very easy. The numbers are very nice and big and easy to touch. You tap the panel to wake it up and it will light up, which then makes it very clear that you're able to punch in your code. Once you type in your code, you can hit the lock icon and you'll hear it unlock. Now, speaking of these touch panel locks like this, I wish that they would just register the first button press before the panel has actually woken up, because having to explain to less technical people in my life that you have to somehow touch the lock to then wake it up and then enter your passcode is a little bit confusing, but it's also a balance with the quoted up to 6 months of battery life for this lock. Of course, if they're going to do something detecting the first press on the panel, it's probably going to eat into that battery life. And of course, for access to this lock, all the people in your Apple home who have the adequate permissions can modify the passcodes for this lock without having the Aqara app installed. But you'll notice that so far we haven't talked about using the Aqara app and adding this lock directly into your Aqara app or binding it to your Aqara hub. And that's because one of the limitations of Apple HomeKey, or features depending on how you look at it, is that it requires the lock to be added directly into Apple Home with HomeKit. You can't use a bridge or a hub, at least that I've seen. And this means that Aqara can't use their Zigbee radios that are in this lock to work with Apple HomeKey. So when you pair it with Apple Home, it's actually using Bluetooth to communicate with your Apple Home. And it's not that uncommon for locks, especially in lower price points, to use Bluetooth. And this means that your Apple Home hubs, let's say your HomePods that are nearby, will use their Bluetooth radios to communicate with the lock. Now, while this connection is lower power, it tends to be slow in my experience, or flaky, particularly when you're talking to a HomePod or doing something where you need that home hub to talk to the lock. If you have your phone out and really close to the lock, whether you're using the Aqara app, it can use the phone's Bluetooth radio to connect to the lock. And once that connection's established, you tapping the button in your app is going to be really fast. But this is also where the Zigbee radio comes in with the Aqara hub, because you can have your Aqara hub talk to the lock over Zigbee, and that's going to be much faster in my experience. And just in general, it's much more of a reliable technology for doing these kinds of things. And you could use this lock with Apple Home by exposing your Aqara hub to Apple Home via Matter, but then, at least as far as I understand things, it wouldn't also work with Apple HomeKey, which is probably a key feature you want if you're interested in this lock and you use Apple devices. And speaking of HomeKey, that's another part of this lock that's actually really fast in my experience. Because of that, I think direct communication between the phone or your watch and the lock, it unlocks very quickly when you tap your phone or watch to the lock. And this gets me to the kind of person, maybe you, who this lock would actually be perfect for. And that's someone who maybe doesn't do a lot of their automation for their smart home inside of Apple Home. They kind of just have Apple Home around to get a handful of things to work the way they want, maybe some integrations with their Apple TV, like who's at the door with a doorbell, or things like this Apple HomeKey, where you have an iPhone or Apple Watches even, and you can tap those on your lock to be let in, but most of your smart home automation is done on some other platform like Amazon or Google. And in a lot of those cases, you can use the Matter support or the direct Amazon support to expose this lock and other Aqara devices to those systems and manage your automations over there, while also just using Apple Home and HomeKey to let yourself in the home. Now, I didn't try this sort of multiple platform integration because I'm really just focused on Apple Home. That's generally why I tend to avoid Bluetooth smart locks like this, and why this lock isn't really ideal for me. But if you're only partially into Apple Home, I think this lock could be a really compelling option. Now, if you're interested in checking it out, there's a link to Amazon below, which is a way to support the channel at no additional cost to you. And if you want to know more about Apple HomeKey, check out this video linked somewhere here on the screen. Thanks again so much for watching, and I hope to see you in your next video.